Hi, welcome back to another episode of From Dropout to JD. I'm your host, Adesua, and this week's guest is Vincente.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vicente Virgil, and I am a district court judge in Colorado.
That's awesome. So, how did you become a judge? What's that process like?
Well, it was a long and crazy story. So I grew up in the area that I am a judge in. My family is in the carnival business, so we kind of traveled around a lot. But it's really I really feel lucky to be able to preside over a court in the community that I grew up in. I dropped out of high school when I was younger, and I mostly made that decision because I had always kind of envisioned that my path would involve working for my family and with my family. I never really. It was hard for me to think about other avenues and other ways to make a living apart from what my family did. But because of that, I kind of got into a conflict with my father, who then, because I dropped out of high school, kind
Mm,
of pushed me away from the family business, and that was difficult for a lot of years, and I was kind of probably a little bit lost in my 20s. But eventually, I got my GED, and I went back to finish my undergraduate degree. Um, Law school was kind of a random decision.
okay.
Um, I got my undergraduate degree in poetry, and I
Love that.
remember when you graduate from undergraduate school, they sit you down and have a meeting with you and kind of go over the bill at that point in time and go over your student loans, and it's time to pay the piper. I remember distinctly thinking, oh, maybe I should go to grad school. I don't really like this.
Oh, you just cut
Speak for
out.
myself.
What was that last part?
Oh, I said, when I got the bill, basically, I was thought, oh, maybe I should go to grad school and put off paying off these student loans for a little while longer. Um,
That's exactly where I'm at. That and the fact that I don't want to work my 40-hour job anymore, and I just want to kind of just study and be a student again.
Yeah,
Um,
and it was funny. I wasn't that great of a student, so I'm not sure why.
oh,
It was mostly a bill avoidance thing.
interesting. So,
Um, I remember I was looking into getting my master's in fine arts and poetry.
okay.
Um, I was also looking into going to library science school, and
Word.
then also looking into law school. And as most of the major happenings in my life, it was kind of a random happenstance that law school happened to get back to me first. And so I just decided that was good enough for me, and I decided to go.
That's so chill. I don't know. You just seemed like, okay, I'll do this thing, and then you just go and do it. I love that.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I have so many questions. When I think of politicians, or well, I guess would you consider yourself a politician?
Well, so in Colorado, they have a they have a different sort of judicial selection process that is that tries to take some of the political aspect out of the process. So in Colorado, we don't campaign for our judicial positions as they do in some other states. In Colorado, what happens, you go through an application process,
Okay.
and the governor appoints you for an initial term, and then you stand for retention in subsequent years. For my particular position, the governor appoints you to a provisional 2-year term, and then for district court judges, you stand for retention every 6 years after that.
Okay. Interesting. So, do you like agree with that method? Is that like your political styling as well?
I've never lived any place where they've had a different method of selecting judges, so it's hard
Okay.
for me to imagine a system that they have in a number of different places where it's basically just like any other type of elected office, where you campaign and run. I
Right.
think it's very important for the judiciary to be as apolitical as possible, and I think more intelligent people than me would probably argue that it's impossible to be apolitical, especially in any sort of government capacity. Um, but I think it's important to be distant from that, so that the community, no matter what sort of political stripe can have confidence in your decisions. I think especially right now, we see a lot of things in the news where the Supreme Court is very politicized, and I think it hurts us as a society to not have full confidence in those type of decision makers. So I really like the Colorado system and the way that that's.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thinking about how the consequences of the distrust that we have for our elected officials is kind of evolving into what Colorado is doing, where it's more apolitical, as you say.
It's really, to me, important because historically in Colorado and across the country, there are many populations that have, for very good reasons, had a distrust of government generally and a distrust of the justice system specifically. And growing up as a young Latino male, that is kind of the atmosphere that I grew up in. I'm very familiar with the feeling of interacting with the police and being very, very scared and frightened, and coming to the courthouse and being very, very scared and frightened. The more I think that we can take away our judiciary from those sorts of political currents, I think that helps us hopefully to create an atmosphere that's less fear-based and less anxiety-based, which is really important depending on the population that you're serving.
Right. Interesting. So I'm from Texas, so this is like foreign to me, but in a good way. So I guess you would consider yourself progressive. Do you use labels like that?
I don't use labels like that, and actually, our judicial canons, the code of conduct that judges have to abide by in Colorado, specifically state that judges should not engage in political activity and should not engage in political. In order to reach that goal, of maintaining an appearance of integrity and a lack of bias and impartiality. So in Colorado, that is part of the structure, is that once you are a judge, you are specifically forbidden, whether in your professional capacity or even in your personal life, from taking political positions, participating in political activisms, protests, assemblies, anything like that.
Interesting. So, if I wanted to be a judge, what advice would you give to me on like how to go about that process?
Well, I think for someone who wants to become a judge, they first really need to examine why they are doing it and what they want to accomplish. So it was very important for me when I was going into this process. So where I live has a very significant Latino population, but the leaders of the political leaders of the community haven't always been representative of the community that they serve. And in Colorado, historically, up until probably the last handful of years, the bench in Colorado has been overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male. And it is hard for a community, I think, to look at a judiciary that does not reflect the community, that does not look like what the community sees when they look in the mirror, and have faith and confidence in those sorts of decisions. So that was part of my motivations to become a judge, is that I had concerns about the lack of Latino representation on the bench. And I was in a point in my career where, I had significant experience and I had a good reputation, I think, in the legal community. And so as someone who is a person of color, if you are ultimately find yourself in that position, I think sometimes you have to have a conversation with yourself and say, do I have somewhat of a responsibility to stick my neck out and put my name in for these sorts of positions, so that we can have a more representative. I don't think that essential analysis is different no matter what your background is. I think it's very important that you are motivated for some reason other than ego and ambition.
Mm,
to be that kind of job, because fundamentally, as a judge, you're a community servant. Um, and you need to go into that job with that attitude. I think each and every day you need to feel very lucky that you have the opportunity to serve your community, and you need to appreciate the impact that the decision that you make affect your community. um, Being a judge is the sort of job that I think, if you have the capacity for narcissism, for ego, this job has the capacity to bring that out in you. If you have the capacity for cruelty, I think this job will bring it out in you. So it's
mm.
very, very important that you practice active compassion and are really honest with yourself of why you want to do this work.
Wow, that's so thoughtful. I really enjoyed that answer. That's cool because well, for those who don't know, I'm like moving to DC for a
Hmm.
congressional internship.
Oh, that's great. I did not know that. That's awesome.
Thank you. And I will be working for a former mayor, Marilyn
Hmm.
Strickland from Tacoma, Washington.
Uh-huh.
And I was doing research on her and I was listening to her podcast, and she was talking about what it was like when she was mayor and how it really, like, she was like for the people. Like, she, like, what she did was solely for the people. And you don't see that on CNN or like on the news. Like, you don't get that kind of energy from the elected officials.
Hmm.
It's seems more, I don't even know what it seems like anymore. It seems more like a game than promoting health and well-being for people's lives.
Well, and that is exactly why I think that our jobs should be apolitical to the extent that they can be apolitical,
Hmm.
because like your perspective of that, your perspective of what the government is to you,
Hmm.
like that's sad, that in some way that's tragic, that something that is so important to just how an everyday person lives their lives, that you clearly don't have a lot of confidence in that,
Mm.
in those politicians in that branch of government. That's why I think it's so important for the judiciary to scrupulously honor our duty to be persons of integrity and to maintain that public confidence in our judicial system. Because if you suffer a problem, whether that be a crime, whether that be a labor problem, whether that be a family problem like a divorce, you should have faith and confidence that there is an institution that will help you solve that problem. That even if ultimately the decision that is made you disagree with, you can respect it and you can have confidence that that was the right outcome. When things become games, when things seem to be done for other reasons apart from concerns about justice, that's when you start to lose faith in the justice system. And that I think does tremendous damage to our society.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. So I guess what things do you recommend, or like any suggestions on how we can go about remedying the current, I mean, that's such a like large and huge question to ask you, like, oh, how do we
Mhm.
fix this? But do you have any ideas? Like, have you thought about this at all?
Well, so I think there are things that I try to put into practice in my own courtroom, and then I think there are bigger sort of things that, in Colorado at least, I think we are heading in the right direction. But just in terms of the way that I try and conduct my courtroom. So as an attorney, I've been in plenty of courtrooms where when you walk into the door, it feels like you're walking into a prize fight. Like it feels like a hostile environment,
Mm,
where there's just energy of conflict in the air.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I think if that's the environment that you create as the judge, that's how people are going to conduct themselves. They're going to come in hostile, and it's going to feel like a fight. When I don't know that necessarily our work needs to be a hostile conflict.
Mm,
I try to make active efforts to make sure that the atmosphere in my courtroom is open and welcoming. I try to make sure that the atmosphere in my courtroom stays collegial. I try to make sure that the atmosphere in my courtroom, I hope, fosters an air of compromise. because I really do think that the justice system works well when it's a collaborative effort that results in compromise, as opposed to a fight that results in a winner and a loser. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. But I'm curious, like, so what tangible things do you do to have an air of compassion?
Well, so I try to be as respectful as I possibly can to everybody that comes before me.
Okay.
And that can be just little things like making sure I say, you know, good morning, Miss So and so. How are you? It can make sure that. So I do a felony criminal docket. So I am often called upon to have to sentence people for significant lengths of time. Um, I came to the conclusion a period of time ago that even when someone has done something very cruel and offensive to their fellow human beings, me screaming at them or me coming at them from a place of anger, it just doesn't accomplish anything. Like it just gives people an excuse to stop listening. I
Hmm.
think even in those circumstances where someone may have done something very horrible, it is still important to make sure that you are treating them with respect and dignity and giving them some level of hope and just telling them from another human being that even though that you have made a mistake, there is still the capacity for good in you. And no matter how that manifests itself, that
Mhm.
I hope that you're able to fulfill that capacity in some way that brings you some level of peace. I try to make sure that everyone who leaves my courtroom, even if I have done something to them that they clearly disagree with, I try to make sure I do something as simple as wish them luck and tell them I genuinely hope that things go better for you in the future and that you don't find yourself in this type of position again. Um, that's not always the case. Like that, that's not always the case. There are plenty of populations that when they walk into the courtroom, they expect to be yelled at. They expect to be demeaned.
Mm.
They see the system as only being a number in the system, and that's a shame. That's a shame, and I think that means that it's not that person's fault. It means that our judicial system has failed them somewhere down the line. And it's up to me to do what steps that I can take to heal that, even if it's only in a very small way.
Hmm.
I think the second thing that is sort of a larger concern and this is something that our current governor and our recent leadership in Colorado has made great strides is making sure that our judiciary is representative of the community that it served. Um, and while we have a very, very long way to go, um, we have made great strides in the state of Colorado. Our governor has appointed, for example, a historic number of African American women to the bench during his time in office. Um, they're enough so that the number in Colorado is now at least statistically significant, whereas before it was very rarely, if ever, happened. And now we have a sizable community of women of color. We have an increasing amount of LGBTQ individuals who are judges. The governor here has, I think, made active efforts to build a more inclusive judiciary. Our Supreme Court has now, with respect to the continuing education that attorneys must, the rules, the continuing education rules that attorneys must abide by in the state of Colorado, they
Mm.
have instituted a DEI requirement, meaning that attorneys in Colorado now have to take a certain amount of number of education hours in topics related to diversity and equity in the legal profession. So we have been doing a lot of really exciting things in Colorado that I hope, again, will change some of the historic inequities that have been in place in our judicial.
Wow. Okay. So all of that kind of makes me wonder, like, how you became someone with these opinions. Was it from, like, were you always this way, like compassionate, or was there like legal experience you went through that kind of shined a light on what is necessary to kind of progress or like get ourselves towards a place where we're more compassionate when it comes to our criminal system?
Uh, you know, oh, excuse me. I would like to say that I was, but I'm not sure that that is necessarily true. So I will be the first to admit that I probably spent a lot of my younger years as a very kind of lost,
As a what?
as kind of a lost soul. Do you know what I
Oh,
mean?
okay.
I don't know that I had a lot of direction or ambition or really um, desire, I guess, to address inequities. But like I think a lot of people who grow up in a as a member of a traditionally oppressed population,
Hmm.
I think I had a lot of anger and bitterness as a young man. Um, I I dropped out of high school. I spent most of my 20s um, working as a janitor, working as a food service, washing dishes, cooking. Like that was primarily the the labor fields that I was involved in. It was not until I started having nieces and nephews that were starting to get a little bit older and starting to be that sort of middle and high school age where I thought that it was sad that no one in our family had ever had that type of college experience. That
Mm.
my younger nieces and nephews, now that they're getting that age, they don't have anybody to reach out to as a resource. Like when it comes to things like filling out financial aid documents or scholarship applications or college applications, like nobody in our family had the experience to help them. So that was part of my motivation to go back um, into education, get my GED, go back to college. Was that at least somebody that they'd have some type of resource, that they'd have someone to reach out with that had that experience. Um, and even then, I don't know that I took my undergraduate education as seriously as I could have, because even then, I guess I always imagined that whatever happened at the end, whatever happened after I graduated, that I wouldn't fundamentally be in a different like place in life after that. That I would probably still be, at the time cooking in restaurants and doing that type of work. Um, like I said, law school was sort of a very random decision. Um, it wasn't until I was in law school a little bit that I became interested in doing work in the field of indigent defense, and representing people in criminal cases who could not afford representation on their own. And as I progressed through law school, that kind of became my focus. And then I went after law school to work at the public defender's office here in Colorado, and I
Okay.
worked there for several years. Um, I think it was not until I was actually doing that work that I kind of made an active effort to be more community focused in my thinking. But still, even then, there was a lot of things going on in my life that made me not, I think, live up to my potential in the way that I felt that I probably could. It honestly, I'd assume, if I had to be honest with myself, I think probably the motivating factor for me to really be in the place that I am now, just in terms of my headspace, is when I had kids. Once I had kids of my own, I think that motivated me to really examine what sort of legacy I wanted to leave for my children and what sort of legacy I wanted to leave for my community and like what I wanted the world to look like for my daughters. Um,
Hmm.
I think it was not until that point in time that I really started putting active efforts into seeing what I could do for my community.
Hmm. Wow. So, how old were you when you finished your GED?
Let me see. I got my GED. So I dropped out of high school in I think 1994. I got my GED not too long after that. I think it was probably 1996, 97,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere around there. I graduated from undergraduate school at Colorado State University in 2005. And then I graduated from law school at the University of Colorado in 2008.
Okay. Okay. And then you worked as a public at the public defender's office after you graduated from law school.
Yes, I worked at the public defender's office for about 6 years.
Okay.
Um, and then ultimately I left the public defender's office. I was doing some work in in immigration law and in juvenile law
Mm-hmm.
um, after that. And then I ultimately went back to working in private practice as a criminal defense attorney until I was appointed to the bench in 2019.
Oh, that's fairly recent. That's
Mhm.
awesome.
Yeah, I'm still the new guy here. So
Awesome. Okay. So what is it like being a judge? Like, is it a classic 9 to 5, or do you work like 60 hours a week? Like, what is it? What's your day to day?
well, so when I was a public defender, that's a very, very hard job. That was
Oh,
probably 60, sometimes 70, 80 hours a week. Like
wow.
just because you have so many clients and so little time. And it's the type of job that's very easy to lose yourself in. And I had a lot of problems with like self-care during that time in my life because that's a very common, unfortunate experience for people who do that type of work. Um, when I was in private practice, my work-life balance was much better, and I was very, very happy. I think in private practice, doing criminal defense work, like I was very, I think, confident in doing my job. I feel like I was good at it, and I think I was very happy. I had a good quality of life. Once I made the transition to the bench, the work is, if I had to describe it, Adesua, I would say that I am less happy than I was as an attorney, but I am more proud of the work that I am doing, if that makes sense. So I do a lot of like service activities in connection with the legal community now that I'm on the bench. I do more
Okay.
community service work, not related to legal issues. Now that I'm on the bench, I probably put more time in than I did as an attorney, but it's more, the time is more personally fulfilling. Like I feel very proud and very lucky about the job that I have and about the things I am able to do. Um, being a judge opens a lot of doors, I think, to service opportunities. And so I feel really lucky about that. And I try to make sure that I take advantage of that as much as I can. For example, the first year I was on the bench, I got involved with an organization here locally that puts on an event called the Migrant Christmas Fiesta
Oh,
that gives, it's just giving presents to the children of our many migrant workers and refugee parents in the area. And I got to dress up like Santa Claus, and that was just a really fun thing. It was just really fun. Um, since I grew up here, I've been able to like go back to the high school that I attended and talk to students there and just tell them about my experiences about dropping out, and hopefully giving them some hope that even though I dropped out of high school, like I was able to overcome that. Like even if they are at a point where they feel as a student in high school they feel unsuccessful or they feel unprepared, like I try to express to them that I don't care how bad of a student they are. They were not as bad of a student as I was in those years. And, you have the capacity for greatness in you. Like you have the capacity for success. It's okay if you're not immediately successful. Like there's time. Like there's time to turn that around and go places that you want to be. Um, I've been doing a lot of work trying to continue to increase efforts to increase diversity on the bench. So doing things like helping judicial applicants with their applications and doing mock interviews and things like that. So hopefully, you know, persons of color and other applicants from diverse backgrounds can feel more prepared in that process than I was. And hopefully that again increases representation in the judiciary. So I'm very busy. I do a lot of work separate from just the work that I do while I'm presiding over my courtroom. But it's very, very meaningful to me, and I feel like that gives me a lot of energy to continue to do it.
okay. So I guess I'm curious as to how you learned to be like your position. Do you have a mentor? Do you shadow people? Like, what does that process look like?
So they do set you up with support. Colorado has a really good judicial education system.
Oh,
They have it's kind of like they call it baby judge school that you go to that kind of teaches you some of the day to day. I'm really lucky that the bench here locally is very collegial, and I have a lot of people locally that operate as mentors and are always willing to help me when I have a question. And through some of my work, specifically with working towards increasing diversity on the bench, I've made connections with other diverse judges around the state who've been a really, really valuable resource to me, especially because I can talk to them about issues that I think are unique to judges of diverse backgrounds. That is really helpful for my mental health, if nothing else, to have
mhm.
someone that I can share a common experience with. Um, so there is a lot of support. I've been really, really lucky that in the place that I am at in Colorado, that the local bench works very hard to ensure the success of their newer judges, and they are invested in the success of the newer judges. I hope that that continues, and I hope that as I become more experienced, that I can take on some of those mentorship roles and assist newer judges as they come into our system and make sure that they are well situated for success.
You mentioned self-care and mental health a couple times. Could you kind of expand on that and what kind of like how does a judge do self-care, I guess, or like what advice do you have for people in law school or people getting their GEDs for mental health sakes?
I mean, I can, and I can be really. I'll try to be really honest with this conversation from my perspective. So it took me a long time to, I think, respect myself. And looking back at my journey through the educational system and my journey as an attorney, I was not very successful in keeping an eye on my mental health and dealing with stress in a productive way. Um, in law school, the main way that I dealt with stress, and I think unfortunately this is all too common in law schools, at least at the time. I've been out of that environment for some time. Was alcohol. That was the main sort of way that I had to let off steam during those years. At the public defender's office and in a lot of, frankly, public service type of areas, that's also a very common problem. Um, when you are in a field that deals with a lot of trauma, um, that secondary trauma has an effect on you. Public defenders suffer from a very, very high rate of burnout because they have enormous caseloads. Because of the enormous caseload, the job is almost impossible. The type of person that work attracts is generally a very compassionate person. It's a person that cares more about people than they do about money, and
Mm,
who are drawn to that type of work because they really want to make a difference in people's lives and try and help the most vulnerable parts of our society. And it
mm,
is unfortunate that the type of compassion that attracts that sort of person in that job also is the person that is most negatively affected by that type of work and high levels of stress on a day-to-day basis. Um, the reason that I left the public defender's office, a job that I tremendously loved, with working with people that I cared about so much, and some of whom are my probably the closest friends that I've ever had and ever will have. The reason that I left that job was because of burnout and mental stress.
mm,
I remember very specifically driving to work one day and thinking about a case and thinking about how I really needed a continuance on this case because I was not prepared.
mm,
And I was worried that the judge was going to deny me a continuance and that my client was going to suffer. And I remember very distinctly thinking, oh, I only wish maybe if I like drove off the road or I got in like a car accident,
Mm.
then they'd have to give me a continuance. Then my client would be okay. Like they couldn't do anything but give me. And I've heard other people in that profession tell me that exact same story in almost that exact same circumstance, where they were like driving down the road wishing, oh, I wish that I would just get in a wreck and then some of the stress would go away. Um, it was at that point in time I realized that I had to step away, like for my mental health. Like I was done mentally. Like I was at a place that I don't think that I could fix myself. And and I think it is only relatively recently that those sorts of discussion about self-care and mental health in our profession have really been acceptable to have. Because when I left the public defender's office, I felt like I failed. I felt like I failed. Uh, I felt like I failed poor people. I feel like I failed all of my clients that desperately needed help. I felt like I failed my colleagues who would then have to pick up the slack of my caseload. And all of my focus was on the outside as opposed to myself and what I needed to do to heal myself and what I needed to do to deal with stress so I wouldn't get in that place again. Um, it's so important in our high stress profession that it is okay to talk about your mental health struggles and it is okay to talk about your difficulties. Um, I am very lucky that because of the very fulfilling work that I am doing now, that it doesn't affect me in the same way as it once did. It gives me positive energy as opposed to like um, burdening me with negative energy. Um, but I think it's important for judges, especially, to recognize that in the attorneys that appear before them, and to recognize when I might have a public defender in front of me, or I might have a district attorney in front of me that looks like they might not be in a good place with their mental health, and they might not be in a good place because of the stress of this, and addressing it and recognizing that and making sure that I am not doing something to exacerbate that problem. Does that make sense?
But yeah, I'm hearing you. That makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense. Yeah. Um, I'm just thinking about my mental health and how I'm like kind of figuring out how I can like apply what you're talking about to my
Mhm.
life while doing this podcast. Let me just put a little bookmark or real quick on that. Um, so with being a judge, did your mental health get better?
I think it did. I think it did because I'm very proud of what I did.
Okay.
Um, and I was very proud of what I was doing at the public defender's office. I was but I always felt like I was failing just because
Hmm.
I did not. It's virtually impossible. It's virtually impossible to do that job because of the crushing caseloads. And I think almost anybody who you talk to who is a public defender or a district attorney, I don't think it's any different on that side as well, will tell you just how difficult it is to deal with high stress, traumatic cases and the volume. Um, it's very, very difficult. But that is both on both sides, both on the public defender side as well as the district attorney side. It is literally the most important work, legal work, that people can do. Do you know what I mean? It's so fundamental to our society.
Mm.
Um, if I had to make a suggestion to a young practitioner in those sorts of fields, I would tell them make sure that you are checking in with yourself every single day. Just make sure that you are checking in with your body and your mind every single day, and that you learn to recognize when you maybe are not going in a good place, and make sure that you take a vacation, step away, take a day off. Doesn't have to be something huge, but it's so vital to our to those people who do that very important work. It's also vital to the people that they serve, the clientele, both on the victim side and on the defendant side, that um, they are receiving the the work that they deserve.
Right. So yeah, that's great advice and something that I can definitely implement because I hmm, I struggle with mental health stuff and
Mhm.
it's really hard to feel like justified with it because it's not talked about and like I think it wasn't until the pandemic that I started taking it more seriously because that's the first time I saw people be like bosses say if you think you're sick don't show up,
Yeah.
like not even if you like if you're sick, if you feel any inkling of an idea just don't show up, let's keep it safe and just stay home. So once that message started spreading and that became the new norm, I started taking my own health more seriously because it became like the popular thing to do in a way. Um, but there's still not enough conversation around what tangible things you can do because we talk about self-care, but it sometimes it looks like a spa day or a shopping spree or like buying a meal or something like that. And not everyone can spend money on those things.
Hmm.
So when you say things like stepping away or going on a vacation or a staycation and just taking the day off, like that's real tangible advice that I personally can implement into my life. So that's
Well,
really cool.
and I think it's important to recognize that I am very, very lucky that I, through the nature of my profession, am in a place of privilege where I can where those are possibilities, because
Right.
there are plenty of people who are living paycheck to paycheck
Excuse me.
who have the same concerns about self-care and same concerns about mental health, where those are not realistic ways to be able to address that problem.
Yeah.
I think we have a very serious mental health crisis in this country. I think that, especially culturally, like my community, my background, that's not something that traditionally has been an acceptable conversation to have in Latino households. And
Right.
it's my understanding that among other communities of color and other people of diverse backgrounds, that's not always an acceptable conversation to have. I think it's so important for us to be really open and honest and vulnerable about our issues, both to deal with them ourselves, but also to present that as a model to others, that these are okay topics to talk about. These are okay conversations to have. Like, it doesn't, if I say I'm having struggles with mental health issues, like, that's okay to say to you. Um, for example, how do you say, well, if I told you that I was having, if I had an asthma attack, or if I had, joint pains or arthritis, like, you wouldn't think less of me if I shared that with you. You wouldn't think I was weak. And we really need to change the discourse in this country with respect to mental health, make that an acceptable conversation to have.
Yeah, for sure. And I think something that I'm struggling with in like as I go from working in job at jobs like Starbucks, Chipotle, like Home Depot, to a 9 to 5 in an office where there's like a
Mm-hmm.
dress code, is the culture of like being productive or at least looking productive. Um, to like in what I guess to give an example, at my previous jobs that I just worked at up until today, um, people were kind of judgmental if you weren't working past like 5, like
Mm-hmm.
which is when we would go home. So like most people, I've even talked to coworkers who would say they just stay 10 minutes late so it looks like they're being more productive than like even if they're not doing anything, just so that our boss thinks that they're hardworking, which everyone is hardworking. Like I don't think anyone is slacking off at that job specifically. Um, so in places that cultures like that are kind of like the standard, where like how do we introduce conversations of mental health and clocking out when it's time to clock out because we have other things to do, etc.
And it's silly. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's silly
It is.
because, to say, oh, this guy that's staying 10 minutes after 5 but doing nothing is more productive than the person who goes home early because they were more efficient about getting their tasks done. Like, it's just silly in a way. But I agree with you 100%. I hope the conversation seems to be getting more acceptable, and I hope it only I hope it only progresses from there.
Absolutely. And something that you mentioned previously kind of sparked this question I had about imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
Have you ever dealt with that in your profession?
Yes. So I am currently in a leadership training course put on through the Colorado Bar Association
Hmm.
called Cobalt. That's designed for both practitioners and judges with the idea of developing, the next generation of leaders in the legal community. And we discussed that issue extensively.
Oh.
So, you know, and just to kind of bring that discussion, imposter syndrome is just this feeling that is particularly an issue with women, particularly an issue with persons from diverse backgrounds, where they feel like their accomplishments are fake, where they feel like they are a fraud, and that that just kind of that nagging feeling in the back of your head that somebody's going to find out, like somebody's going to find out someday that this was all a fluke and this was all this was all a big mistake and I shouldn't be where I'm at. Um, that's really destructive, especially to diverse individuals who are often in a position where they feel like they have to work twice as hard to be seen as equals. Like, and I feel that quite a bit, frankly. I feel like if I was
Mm,
an average judge, I would be seen as a below average judge. And for me to be seen as an average judge, I need to be an exemplary judge. You know what I mean? I
mm,
need to work harder. I need to be more well read, more researched, more dignified on the bench. I need to go above and beyond. Um, I've had the opportunity. I'm really, really blessed to be in this leadership training class. It's 20 attorneys and judges from across the state.
oh.
And it's remarkable like how common that feeling is among us. And these are very, very impressive individuals, way more impressive than me. Um, I I I have a woman in my class who was a primary counsel in some opioid litigation, like suing some pharmaceutical companies with respect to the opioid crisis. And I remember her telling me about that, and I was just like, "You're amazing! Like I can't believe that's amazing work." I was so impressed with the work that she was doing. And then she would talk about how she would always feel like being a woman in that environment, like she was always looked down upon, like she always
Mm,
felt like they treated her like a secretary more than like an attorney when she was an integral factor in that litigation. I have other people in my class that have done just so much like amazing, important work. Um, and it's weird to see these very accomplished people still have that feeling of inadequacy. And a
right.
lot of our leadership program has talked about like strategies on how do you overcome that? Like, how do you move past that? How do you um, appreciate your own accomplishments and appreciate the hard work that you've done. Um, it's been really beneficial to me. I think that has helped. I think with respect to imposter syndrome, community is something that really helps.
Mm, mm,
Go like fellowship with people who are of a similar background of you, and even not necessarily a similar background, but have that same feeling, and so that you can talk about that, and so that you can be in support of each other and say, the person that you see yourself as is completely different from the person that I see you as. Like I see you as this amazing, inspirational person. Like the fact that you feel inadequate, like blows my mind. I can't wrap my head around that. And even with this, even you with this, Adesanya, like I'm listening to these episodes and they're so inspirational. And this was such like a brilliant idea to reach out to a population that is necessarily going to feel inadequate. Like they feel like they've made a mistake by dropping out. They feel like
yeah.
that's an obstacle that's hard to overcome. And you putting these stories and these narratives and this energy out in the world, like that's such an impressive thing to me.
Wow.
So when I say that, when you tell me, like I sometimes I feel that way, like this is the only you that I know, and the only you that I know is so impressive and is doing such great things for the world. And that's why I think that community is so important, so that you can be reinforced with your successes and your accomplishments.
Yes, community is integral. Having support is life, like day and night,
Hmm.
honestly. The only reason why I was able to go back to school was because I moved back home in with my parents.
Hmm.
Well, and it's because I got caught during COVID when they shut down the airports and all that.
Uh,
So like there's some divine intervention and all that, but yeah, no. Community is really integral.
and it's that experience, how to say, well, like wherever you go in your career, like that perspective is in and of itself valuable. And wherever you go, you will be able to take that perspective and experience with you, and it will benefit whatever you choose to do, whether it's, whatever field of law you choose to practice, whether or not you end up like me on the bench, or whether you go into politics and you're Senator Adesua someday. Like that perspective, like that knowledge, that experience, it benefits us all. It's easy, especially like from my perspective. Part of that imposter syndrome is feeling from my end like, oh, the only reason that I got this job is because I was a Latino male. Do you know what I mean? The only reason that I got this job is as
Because
a
you're
token,
what?
is as a
Oh,
token, is as a
okay.
Latino. Do you know what I mean? Because they
Yeah,
wanted
I
to
know what
check
that
off a
means.
box.
Right.
But that discounts like the unique perspective and knowledge and what my experience brings to the table. Like
Mhm.
diversity is not important because it's important to have every population represented.
Mm.
Diversity is important because it is important that every perspective is represented. Every storehouse of knowledge is represented. All that generational experience and generational knowledge is important, so that we can make decisions and we can take actions that are to the benefit of every single person that lives in our community, regardless of what they look like. So imposter syndrome is a horrible thing. Adesewa, I could tell you that just from the little bit that I know of you and this project, I am nothing but impressed. So I hope that you take that with you. Do you know what I mean? I hope that you acknowledge this accomplishment that you are currently doing and the positive energy that I think you're putting out to the world.
Absolutely. And I hate to do this, but my name is pronounced Adesua.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Adesewa.
I've
Adesewa.
been laughing. I don't know if y'all can see, but I've been laughing this entire time because it's really endearing. I don't like correcting people, but I it's been like 4 or 5 times, and I feel like people were gonna start calling me that if I didn't do something.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I should be the one. I know how that feels. As a guy with the name of Vicente, I 100% feel you there. So I apologize for that.
No, you're perfect. So there's two more questions that I have before we
Sure.
wrap this up. They're the two questions I usually end on. It's, do you have any advice for someone who is in your position, which I think we kind of touched on. So if you feel that that's been touched
Mhm.
on, we can go to the next one, which is any regrets, and if so, what or why not?
So I regret not appreciating the importance of self care
Mm,
and mental health earlier in my life. I regret not appreciating and checking in with myself mentally and physically to recognize when I was in a difficult space. And I feel like I could have, had I done that, been kinder to certain people in my life. I feel like I could have accomplished more things at certain periods in my life, even though things have turned out well for me now. And I am very proud of the work that I'm doing now. Um, I wish that I was more honest with those conversations earlier than I have been, because I think it would have saved a lot of pain for me personally, and it would have probably saved a lot of pain towards the people that were close to me and that loved me and cared about me during those times. So I hope if someone listening to the conversation takes anything away from this, I hope that that's what they take away, that it's so important to make sure that you are actively caring for yourself and loving yourself and respecting yourself, so that whatever great things you're going to accomplish, you will remove those difficulties as an obstacle.
That's beautiful. As RuPaul says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anyone else? That is true. That's so true. Um, well, thank you so much for this conversation. I cannot believe I got a judge to talk on this podcast. That is a huge pat on the back and just super impressive. Like you went from a high school dropout to being a judge. Like that is so impressive. So thank you so much for talking and sharing your story. It's been a pleasure.
Well, and can I tell you, thank you so much for inviting me. I was truly honored to take part in this project. I really do think that you're doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye, y'all.